So welcome to today's webinar, Research Update, Gut Bacteria and Multiple Sclerosis. As I said earlier, your presenter is Dr. Wolfgang Marx and I'm your facilitator, Jen East. We acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians, past and present, on whose land we meet today. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and the relationship of Aboriginal people to country and respect the cultural authority of the elders in each community. So today is going to be a research update, and so the information that is presented is based on research findings and does not include management strategies. Individuals should seek further advice regarding their own situation by contacting MS Connect on 1800 042 138. Today's presentation is prepared and presented by an independent expert, and the views presented are not necessarily the views of Multiple Sclerosis Limited. Individuals are encouraged to seek further advice regarding the relevance of the information presented to their situation. I want to begin this presentation with just some acknowledgement of MS Research Australia, and we've got Ajana from MS Research Australia who's just going to present a few slides.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Ajana. I'm the Research Translation Coordinator at MS Research Australia. We are part of the MS Australia family, and we were born out of the MS societies with the sole purpose of providing a more nationwide approach to funding research. And about 1/3 of our funding comes from the MS societies, and we have independent fundraising avenues, and we also have a few bequests and some government initiatives to help support the work we do. How we work together with MS Australia and MS societies is that we put our heads together and try to identify gaps in the MS space. So we try to see what the needs of the people with MS are that are not being met, and how we can better improve the care and management of people with MS, and then fund research that addresses those gaps. So we collaborate with more than 54 universities and research institutes across Australia. We have more than 900 researchers and clinicians, medical professionals on board. We've funded more than 200 grants so far, and people like Wolf, who is also partially supported by us, the amazing work he's done, are doing some great work to move some of these priorities along. And we're hoping we can bridge some of those gaps that we've identified. And another thing that we do is we help translate some of that work. So when researchers come up with amazing findings that then need to be moved to actually be implemented to help people with MS, we help translate that work. And along that vein, we have a few clinical trials that are currently recruiting for participants. So we really appreciate people that have already enrolled and helped us along. Two clinical trials that I really do want to highlight are on sleep apnea and falls prevention, two important issues that need to be addressed in MS. We've got a few more trials recruiting too, and more information can be found on our MS Trials website if you want to get involved and help in that way. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ajana. Thank you very much. So just an introduction to Wolfgang. Wolfgang is a postdoctoral research fellow and head of nutraceutical research stream at Food and Mood Centre. Wolfgang is also an accredited practicing dietitian and an honorary research fellow at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health, La Trobe University and Bond University. Wolfgang's current research program covers a broad range of projects involving the use of nutraceuticals for mental health, fatigue and cognition. Of particular interest is the role of Polyphenols, compounds found abundantly in spices, fruits and vegetables, in multiple sclerosis and gut microbiome. So welcome, Wolf, and thanks very much for being with us today. I'm going to give you control now so you can present your slides. So hang 10. There you go.
Okay, is that coming through fine?
It is, so I can see you and I can see your presentation.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining me today to talk about the gut bacteria and multiple sclerosis. I suppose I want to start this presentation by, I guess, echoing some of the words already said by Jen and Arjana by thanking everyone for joining me today. This area of the gut bacteria, our gut microbiome, and how it might affect our chronic diseases and our health and our brain and everything is an area that I'm completely fascinated by, and so I'm really it's a real pleasure to present today and tell you a little bit about what myself, my collaborators, and the research community in general are doing in this space, into talking about the evidence for the gut-brain axis, or our gut microbiome, and how it relates to what we eat, and how it might be linked to our brain and multiple sclerosis in general. So if we were doing this webinar perhaps, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or something, if I said gut bugs, people would be thinking of an upset stomach, E. coli, food poisoning, these sorts of things. But now we're realizing more and more and that the gut bacteria, they aren't all bad. There are a whole host of different gut bacteria that play a really beneficial role, or a beneficial role in all sorts of chronic disease and all sorts of processes in our health. And right now it's quite, I call it kind of like a gold rush or a frontier in research, in that the gut microbiome is being looked at for pretty much every sort of condition and chronic disease out there, because there seems to be this really central role in the gut microbiome. So to give a bit of an overview, the gut microbiota, it consists of tens of trillions of microorganisms, at least 1,000 different known species of bacteria that we've identified so far. There are more than 3 million genes living exclusively in the gastrointestinal tract, 100 times more bacterial genes than human genes, and accounts for 50% of our total cell count. So a really kind of weird thought is to say that we're more bacteria than human. And that's, yeah, I don't know, I find that quite a bizarre concept to get my head around, but here we are. You might also be looking at this picture on the right-hand side, and I wanted to include this because I find this a really fascinating image, because this is essentially a zoomed-in cross-sectional view of our gut microbiome. So on the left, we have these sort of hundreds and thousands looking section, and this is different bacteria and things floating around in our gut microbiome. The green part is this mucus layer, and this mucus layer plays a critical role in protecting our gut intestinal lining. And then this blue are actually colon cells. So I find this quite a wild picture, because you're actually sort of seeing what we're talking about, albeit very zoomed in. So the first thing I want to say about the gut and its relationship to the brain, so that sort of relationship I'm referring to as the gut-brain axis, is that it's a bidirectional communication. So our gut can send signals to our brain, and our brain can send signals to our gut. And so there's this kind of bidirectional relationship where one sort of influences the other. And the primary pathway, it does it through a number of different ways, but one of the primary pathways is through this vagus nerve. So this is a nerve that runs from our brain all the way into our gut, and we can send signals up and down that line. So if the gut does talk to our brain and our brain does talk to the gut, well, how are some of the ways that this happens? Well, a lot of what we know at the moment is actually from animal models. So there are more and more studies popping up every day where we're looking at this within humans. But one of the key pieces of evidence so far is the use of germ-free mice. And so what this is an animal model where they're essentially born without a gut microbiome. So when you remove this microbiome out of the equation, you can start to see, well, what happens when we don't have a microbiome? What happens when we don't have gut bacteria playing a role in our system? And what we find is that these germ-free mice, they have an altered stress response, so they're more likely to have a heightened sort of stress response when there's stressful stimuli. They have altered brain plasticity, so their brain structure and function is differed. They have altered levels of neurotransmitters, so things like serotonin and dopamine, things that we know that are related to our behavior and our mood seem to be altered. They exhibit altered behaviors. There's different altered immune systems, so elevated inflammation or compounds related to inflammation, and an altered blood-brain barrier. So this is that sort of protective defense system that our brain has versus that sort of compartmentalizes itself from the rest of the body. And I suppose you could say in germ-free mice, it's somewhat like, I suppose you could say, a porous compared to what it usually is. And so this all sort of says that our gut microbiome seems to play a crucial role in developing some of these systems. So if we zoom into the gut microbiome and in people with multiple sclerosis, if you compare the gut of someone with multiple sclerosis compared to someone without multiple sclerosis, we're finding significant differences in different types of bacteria. So our gut microbiomes are different. Now, at this point, this starts to paint the picture of an association between the gut microbiome and multiple sclerosis. So, but it doesn't really say anything about the direction of that association. So perhaps people with multiple sclerosis, the medications or something about that is influencing our gut microbiome. It's not necessarily saying that our gut microbiome is causing or influencing our risk or our severity of multiple sclerosis. But what we're finding from some other really interesting studies is that there might be this sort of causal role. So there was a series of studies that recruited people with multiple sclerosis and a group of people without. They took microbiome samples from both of these groups and they transplanted that into these germ-free mice models that have, I guess, it's kind of an animal model of multiple sclerosis. So mice don't get multiple sclerosis, but it's kind of like a model that we use to sort of test interventions that might be similar to multiple sclerosis. And so when these gut microbiome samples were transplanted into these mice, the mice that received the gut microbiome from those with MS, they had greater MS severity, greater MS incidence compared to those that received the sample from people without MS. And so this starts to point to, well, maybe the gut microbiome is playing a bit of a causal role that plays a bit of a driver in some of these symptoms and some of the severity and incidence. So that's been a really interesting study, and you can see that it's only happened 2018, 2017. So this is really quite cutting edge recent research. We also know that the gut bacteria can influence neurotransmitters. So our bacteria can synthesize and influence neurotransmitter production. By that, I mean things, again, like serotonin and dopamine. So when we think of, perhaps serotonin, we think that, well, that's just floating around in our brain. However, the large majority of serotonin within the body is actually stored in our gut. And what we're finding is that our gut bacteria can actually interact with these neurotransmitters. Gut bacteria can also affect tryptophan availability and metabolism, which is particularly relevant to multiple sclerosis. And I'll explain. I want to break this down a little bit to explain why. So imagine it's Sunday night, we have our Sunday roast, we eat a protein-rich meal, and when we ingest protein, that gets broken down into amino acids, and one of those amino acids is tryptophan. Now, tryptophan can get broken down further by going down, I guess, two sort of primary routes. It can either go towards synthesizing serotonin, so which can influence our mood, or it can go down this kynurenine pathway. And depending on other factors, such as the level of inflammation in the body, this kynurenine pathway can produce what we're finding to be neurotoxic metabolites. So these metabolites that seem to play a role in damaging parts of the brain and systems related to the brain. And what we've found, again, very recently, 2017 and onwards, is that this production of neurotoxic metabolites seem to play a role in multiple sclerosis progression. So this is potentially a really interesting area that needs to be further explored, but that might be quite relevant to the multiple sclerosis setting. So I've talked a little bit about the gut bacteria and its direct effects on certain systems in the body. But what I also want to talk about is gut metabolites. So by that I mean compounds that are produced by our gut bacteria and how they play a role in our health and multiple sclerosis. And so to explain this, we have our gut bacteria, and just like our gut bacteria, or just like us, our gut bacteria like to eat food. However, what they eat are things called prebiotics, and prebiotics are things like our dietary fiber, polyphenols, omega-3 fatty acids, things that our gut likes to feed on. They like to feed on. And so imagine we eat something like a carrot, which has dietary fiber and some polyphenols in it. Our gut bacteria digests that, and then what happens is it produces a series of compounds as I guess a byproduct of this interaction. And there are some byproducts or metabolites that seem to be potentially harmful to our health, but there are also a whole host of metabolites that seem to be beneficial to our health. And so what I really want to focus on is the role of short chain fatty acids. So this is a byproduct of this reaction. And I want to focus in on this is because this is probably the most well characterized gut metabolite in the gut microbiome literature. And what I find really interesting is that if you look at the gut bacteria that people with multiple sclerosis are low in, this type of gut bacteria that produce the type of gut bacteria that produce short chain fatty acids seem to be lower in people with multiple sclerosis. So this again starts to point the picture, well, maybe this is one of the things that are playing a role in either the symptoms or progression or something to do with multiple sclerosis. So if we look at the possible effects of short chain fatty acids, you can see that there's a lot of evidence showing that it may protect brain cells in other conditions, protect cells against against oxidative stress, so it can act as sort of like an antioxidant, improve learning and memory in mouse models of Alzheimer's disease, promote neurogenesis, promote healthy gene expression, increase mitochondrial activity, which again, as we were talking about in the RELIEF study, might play a role in multiple sclerosis. So it has all these really beneficial properties that seem to help with our brain health. And there's again some quite recent studies, so 2017, where they looked at an animal model of MS. So again, mice don't get MS, but there is an animal model that's kind of our best equivalent of MS. And when investigators gave these mice either short chain fatty acids directly or a high fiber diet, which then resulted in a high production of short chain fatty acids, this resulted in a decrease in disease severity. So this again starts pointing to, well, maybe the short chain fatty acids are playing a bit of a causal role in some of these processes in multiple sclerosis. So if the gut is linked to our brain health, is linked to multiple sclerosis, well, what can we do now to help feed our gut? So what are some of the things that we now know that might be beneficial to our gut microbiome? So there are a whole host of different things that can influence our gut microbiota. So, where we live, the medications we take, the level of exercise, how we were born, whether we have a cat or a dog, pets, urbanization, all sorts of things can influence our gut microbiome. But what we're finding is that diet plays a key and predominant role in influencing our gut microbiome composition. And what we've also found is that the changes in our diet can rapidly alter our gut microbiome composition. And I think this is a really, to me, a quite exciting and I suppose empowering message that we're finding from the literature, because it's not like, oh, well, I have to, take a diet, go on a diet for years upon years before it starts to change our gut microbiome or anything. This is showing that, so for example, in this study, they found that just after 5 days, there was this rapid and significant difference in our gut microbiome. And so to walk you through it, they put 10 participants either onto a plant-based diet where they consumed a diet rich in things like grains, legumes, fruits and vegetables, or an animal-based diet which was very high in fat, high in protein, meats, eggs and cheeses. And they found that there was this really significant change in the gut microbiome. And interestingly, the people that were randomized to the animal-based diet, they saw increases in a particular gut bacteria that's linked to inflammatory diseases. So I thought that was interesting. But then once these participants stopped their diet, so after these 5 days, their gut microbiome reverted back to essentially what their normal gut microbiota was before they started the diet. So again, it sort of points to this message that we can rapidly and meaningfully change our gut microbiome with changes to our diet. So what are some things that we can do to influence our gut microbiome? So for starters, there's fermented foods. So there's a lot in recent years, there's a lot of different food products that have come onto the market, but we have things like yogurt, which are high in probiotics, also kefir, sauerkraut, kombucha is one that's propped up kind of everywhere now. And these foods contain a level of probiotic bacteria, so certain bacteria that we think might be beneficial to our gut microbiome. And so by consuming these foods, you're getting a constant supply of these probiotics that might influence our gut microbiome. Consuming foods that are high in fiber. So again, these are things like your green leafy vegetables, your fruits, your beans, your whole grains, because like I've mentioned with the short chain fatty acids, our gut loves to eat fiber, and by eating fiber, it increases the level of short chain fatty acids, so these healthy metabolites in our gut. Eating a range of different fruits and vegetables with different colors can be beneficial, and the reason for that is because of its polyphenol content, or the differing polyphenol content between these different fruits and vegetables. So for example, the reason why blueberries are blue are because of these polyphenols that are present in the skin of blueberries. So the same things that give the pigment to a lot of different fruits and vegetables are also responsible for some of these healthy effects on our gut and in general. And our gut microbiome, again, loves to chew on these polyphenols, and this results in a whole host of potentially healthy benefits. There's particular foods such as onions, leeks, garlics, asparagus, bananas that are particularly prebiotic. So these have special types of fibers that seem to help improve our gut microbiota composition. And ingesting foods like oats, legumes, cooked and cooled rice, potatoes, and pasta is a source of resistant starch. So what resistant starch is if you cook a potato, you obviously can then eat it, and it's a source of carbohydrates or starch. But if you cook that potato and then put it in the fridge, so for example, maybe you're making a potato salad or a pasta salad, some of that starch then kind of recrystallizes, and it changes its composition in a way that we can no longer consume it for energy. But if we eat it, our gut loves this type of starch because we can no longer consume it, but our gut microbiota surely loves it. So this is a unique sort of source of fiber that's not necessarily present in other sort of fruits and vegetables. On the other side of the coin is minimizing our intake of those highly processed, highly salted, high fat, high sugar foods. Because while we sort of generally know these as junk foods and that they're bad for our health in many other ways, what we're finding is that diets high in salt or diets high in fat, particularly saturated fat, and also things such as artificial sweeteners and preservatives, these seem to be interacting with our gut microbiome in a negative way. So by avoiding some of these less nutrient-dense, more highly processed foods, that might be helping to improve our gut microbiome as well. So to talk about fermented foods and just give a bit of practical advice here. So when you're going out, if you're interested in consuming some of these fermented foods and you're going to Woolies and seeing what's available, some of these are quite high in sugar, so looking for those low sugar alternatives. So if you go to the yogurt aisle, for example, it's a perfect example, I guess, in that we have our Greek yogurts and our natural yogurts, but then we also have some very high added sugar alternatives as well. And if you can, it's best to opt for those lower sugar alternatives. So aiming for kind of 5 to 10 grams per 100 grams for yogurt is a good sort of rule of thumb in this area. If you look at the label, look for those that state live active cultures or label the type of strain and dose. This just gives you a little bit of confidence that the product that you're buying actually contains a sufficient quantity of this live probiotic bacteria. Not all of these fermented foods are FODMAPs friendly. So if you are on the FODMAPs diet, or if you have IBS or these sorts of things, some of these foods aren't going to be so friendly. So for example, cabbage is very low in FODMAPs, but Monash University, they did an interesting study where they looked at the same cabbage, but then fermented in terms of sauerkraut, and sauerkraut is actually very high in FODMAPs. So you just need to pay a bit of attention if this is an issue for you. Coconut yogurt, it just perhaps worth reconsidering, only because it's one, very high in saturated fat, but two, it's missing a lot of the key nutrients that other fermented food products provide. So, for example, dairy yogurt, if you can tolerate dairy, dairy has other helpful nutrients, so B12, your protein, these sorts of things, calcium, these sorts of things. And lastly, you can do it yourself. So I find this kind of just a fun thing to do. Maybe I'm just too deep in the gut microbiome world, but this is a picture of a recent sauerkraut that I've that I've created. So with a name like Wolfgang Marx, you can imagine that there's a bit of German ancestry going on. There's sauerkraut in my veins, and so I like to ferment this, and it's cheap, and you can play around with different recipes that you find on the internet. It's just a little bit of extra thing that you can do. Some general advice is to aim to include vegetables at each meal. So in Australia, predominantly, we get our vegetables at dinner. This is where we sort of think of when we're going to get, where we're going to have the bulk of our vegetables, but trying to move away from this sort of thought process and try and think of ways that you can include vegetables at each meal. Selecting fruits, vegetables, nuts as snacks is a potential strategy. Aiming to eat more beans. So Australia, we don't really eat a lot of beans in general, so that's an easy way to get that resistant starch, those polyphenols, that dietary fiber, if we can try and include that in some of our meals. Eating oily fish, I say this because omega-3 fatty acids are also a prebiotic, we think. Using extra virgin olive oil. Again, this is because it's high in polyphenols, and again, that's sort of an added sort of prebiotic effect. And I've talked about minimizing those discretionary foods, those highly processed foods. And so I guess I just want to emphasize that it doesn't mean cutting them all out or feeling like if you do eat something that's perhaps not sort of just your fruit and veg, that you're ruining your gut microbiome or anything like that. It's really just about minimizing these sorts of foods and having them, for those special occasions as opposed to every day. I also just wanted to quickly talk about some things around probiotics in multiple sclerosis. So there's some very preliminary evidence, both from animals and human studies. So this was some results from animal models of multiple sclerosis, where they found that providing probiotics to these animal models reduced inflammation, progression, symptoms, and improved sort of anti-inflammatory properties. And there is some very, very preliminary evidence in humans that kind of reflect this, where there's been I think there's only been maybe 2 studies so far, but they have found some improvement in markers in people with multiple sclerosis. I will just caution that this is very preliminary. We need some much more research in this area before we start recommending this to everyone, but it is just saying that this is a very sort of interesting, exciting, and new area that we need to keep exploring. If you are interested in probiotics, just some very general advice. So looking for the expiry date. So and that's simply just to ensure that any product that you're buying is fresh. Around the sort of dose of what you need for probiotics, we don't really know, but the general rule of thumb seems to be getting probiotic bacteria in doses of 1 or more billion colony forming units. So that might be presented as CFU on the back of the label. Again, this is very preliminary. We're not really sure. We don't have a great idea of what the most effective dose is just yet. Looking for refrigerated, or on the label it might say enteric coated. This just again sort of goes back to making sure that you're getting like a fresh product. The efficacy of particular strains, so whether you need to go for lactobacillus or this really expensive preparation, etc. We don't really have a great idea of which strains are most effective. This again needs to be further explored. And I will also say that while probiotics may seem attractive in that you can just take a pill and get a dose of probiotics, it's also missing a whole host of other nutrients that other fermented foods might provide. So, for example, again with yogurt, you're getting your protein, you're getting your calcium, you're getting your B vitamins along with probiotics. So it's just something to consider there. And more is not always more. So high doses of probiotics can result in gastrointestinal symptoms and an upset stomach and these sorts of things. So again, just worth keeping in mind. So in summary, the results of our current understanding of the gut microbiome and its role in multiple sclerosis in our brain and more generally our general health is an incredibly fascinating, complex, exciting area, but it is quite preliminary at the moment. We need more studies to help explore what's going on. In terms of what we can take away from this, I've talked about some of those take-home messages that we can do, but really it doesn't necessarily mean we need to go on to any sort of restrictive diets or anything that's terribly complex. When you think about it, it's really just about general healthy eating advice that applies here. Probiotics may be beneficial, but much more evidence is needed to help tease apart this. And the last point is particularly aimed at those that might look at this webinar as a recording, in that new knowledge is coming through every day. This field is rapidly expanding. And so what I say today, we might find new studies that might completely change our paradigm of how we think things. So this is very much a rapidly developing area. What's next for the research that I'm doing and that I'm involved in? So the relief trial, the results are expected to be due late 2020 or 2021, depending on our analyses and recruitment rate. I'm investigating the effects of polyphenol intake on cognitive and mental health outcomes as in multiple sclerosis in a variety of different data sets, both within Australia and otherwise. And I'm also seeking funding for future clinical trials to hopefully build that clinical trial evidence base. And if you're out there listening and think, maybe this would be an interesting PhD project, please contact me. I'd love to talk about some of the projects that we have going. I'll also just briefly plug a conference that I'm organizing or helping to organize in London this year. And we'll have a whole host of different speakers looking at the role of the gut microbiome on our brain health, our cognitive health. It's going to be a really good program. And then finally, of course, my contact details. If you have any questions about the relief trial or anything that I've discussed today, please contact me on my email address or follow along on my Twitter account. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wolf. That was amazing. Thank you so much. And yes, we do have lots of questions, as I expected. So I've written down a few while we're going. And there's a lot of people giving complimentary feedback too, saying this is reassuring because it's things that we know and we've been working towards doing, but to have the evidence behind it has been really reassuring. So thank you for providing the participants of the webinar that reassurance.
Yeah. Like I said, it's absolute pleasure to present today. So I'm glad it's positive feedback.
Yeah, that's right. One person says, how do you test for gut microbiome, and is it recommended to have testing done before making changes, and is this something prescribed by a dietitian or a doctor, and is it worth the expense?
That's a fantastic question. So at the moment, there are a whole host of commercial facing companies that can analyze your microbiome in a variety of different ways. They are often fairly expensive. And I would say that at the moment, I wouldn't really be recommending it. It's unless you're just someone who is just interested from just curious to see what the microbiome might look like. It really we don't know exactly what a healthy microbiome looks like just yet. So there's a whole host of different questions that are kind of unanswered. And so getting a microbiome analysis now doesn't necessarily tell you all that much. Now, if you think to some of the advice that I gave in this presentation, whether fruits and vegetables will drastically improve our microbiome or not, they're still going to be really good for you regardless. So I think making these sorts of changes, adding those fruits and vegetables, adding those high polyphenol foods, getting those resistant starch, regardless, that's going to do your body good. So I think there's no real reason to hesitate or wait for those sorts of things. Probiotics, we might want to wait. But in terms of, your yogurt and all that stuff, I think why not?
Great. There was also a question about, would you recommend a course of probiotics when you need to take antibiotics?
Yeah, so there's some recommendations around that. In general, I think the evidence is relatively strong for if you're experiencing things like antibiotic-associated GI symptoms and diarrhea, that your probiotic interventions might help alleviate these sorts of symptoms. But then there's also been some really recent studies that have shown that people that took these probiotics after antibiotics, their gut microbiome didn't recover as quickly as the people that didn't take the probiotics. And so, while this just goes to how fast this field is moving. If you asked me maybe 2 months ago, I'd say, yeah, it's probably worthwhile taking. Whereas now I feel like there's maybe a little bit of a question mark, and it's something that perhaps we need to keep exploring.
Yeah, interesting. There's also another question about how much fermented food is recommended on a daily basis.
So we don't have any firm recommendations. I would say what you're comfortable with. So there's no point in recommending a tub of yogurt if you're not going to enjoy yogurt or you don't want to eat that much. I think it's really just about any sort of addition to your diet can be something that's beneficial. So whether it's just a little amount or whether you'd love to eat it a lot, I think that's just fine and about as much as we can say at the moment.
And if somebody has an allergy to, is it amines in terms of AMINES?
Amines, yeah.
Amines, yep. Should she avoid fermented food or persevere?
I think if you have intolerances and these sorts of foods are not working for you, then by no means persevere. I think if you're experiencing unpleasant symptoms, then there's no reason to keep pushing through. And in those cases, perhaps focusing on those non-fermented fruits and vegetables that are going to give those healthy prebiotics. And perhaps speaking with your clinician around the role of probiotics might be an alternative route that might be a better route for you.
Thanks, Wolf. I think what we'll do is the other questions that are left for today, I will forward to you, and I will email people directly. And if they're relevant to the whole group, then I'll respond to the whole group. But thank you so much, Wolf, for your time and presentation. I've just got a few ending slides for everyone on board today, so I'll take back control and I will just present those quickly now. But thank you so much, Wolf.
Not a problem. It's been a pleasure.
So as I said, if there's any further questions that people didn't get a chance to type in today, just pop them through either to MS Connect, or you can email them to the education team, which is education@ms.org.au. I just wanted to draw your attention to the Eat Well, Live Well site on our website. It's a really useful part of our website, which people can find out some more information on the foods that Wolf has spoken about today. There's also a tool on that website that you can put in some of the symptoms that you might be experiencing of MS that diet and nutrition can help with. So if you're interested in learning a little bit about that, log on to our website and search for the Live Well or Eat Well, Live Well site. We also have a free range of ebooks which you can obtain the log-on details for via MS Connect. It's a really useful tool to use that you can just download these books, but they're related to a whole range of symptoms and issues relating to MS. We also have a Get Your Act Together tool available on our website, which might give you some direction and information on some symptoms with MS, so emotion, fatigue, continence, cognition, pain and heat sensitivity. It was initially designed for people living in the ACT, but it provides useful information to all people living with MS. We're also a registered provider for the NDIS. So if anybody is interested in learning about what services we provide for the NDIS, please contact MS Connect on 1800 042 138. So thank you for your time today. I hope you enjoyed Wolf's presentation. We do ask that if you have time today to provide us with some feedback or comments, there'll be a short survey after the end of today's webinar. So thanks for being on board today, and I hope you have a great day.